The sky changed before the radios did. Long before the official warnings buzzed across the airwaves, the villagers noticed it, the way the clouds stacked thick and heavy over the horizon, swallowing the afternoon sun in layers of grey and green. The wind, once playful, carried a strange weight, bending trees that had stood straight for decades. Birds fled inland, flocks breaking across the sky like shattered glass. By evening, no one doubted it anymore. The hurricane was coming. In the small coastal town of San Isidro, life shifted into urgency. Men hammered plywood over windows while children carried buckets of water from the well. Mothers gathered candles, bread and rice, their hands moving faster than their prayers. Even the church doors were latched tight, its stained glass windows rattling under the first taste of wind. But in the middle of the square stood something that did not move: the Virgin Mary, carved from pale stone, weathered by decades of sun and salt air, her hands folded gently in prayer, her eyes cast downward in quiet compassion. She had stood there for generations, through harvests and funerals, weddings and festivals, even through storms. To many, she was not simply stone. She was the mother who listened when no one else did, a reminder that heaven had not forgotten them. Now, as the winds gathered, people drifted toward her. Some knelt at her base, laying trembling hands on the cold stone. Others lit candles, despite the wind's first angry whispers, flames flickering defiantly. One old fisherman, his back bent from years at sea, placed his cap on the statue's base and whispered, "If you've ever heard us, Madre, hear us now." But not all shared his faith. Across the square, younger men scoffed, their laughter sharp against the rising tension. "Stone won't stop the winds," one said, shaking his head as he nailed the last board across his shop window. "Better to spend your time tying down roofs than whispering to a statue." Another spat into the dirt, glancing at the praying villagers. "She's weathered, nothing more. When the winds come, she'll fall like everything else." Their words stung, but the faithful did not rise to argue. They kept praying, their voices quiet, weaving like threads of hope against the raw building above them. By nightfall, the warnings were no longer whispers. Radios crackled with urgent voices. Category 4. Landfall expected by morning. Seek shelter immediately. The town scattered. Families locked their doors and huddled together, candles trembling in the dark. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of brine and rain, the first drops splattering against shutters like tapping fingers. Still, a handful lingered in the square. Marta, the widow who had lit a candle at the Virgin's feet every night for 30 years, clutched her rosary with both hands. A group of children clung to her skirt, too frightened to go home. She knelt beside them, whispering, "She watches. Don't be afraid. She watches." The scoffers passed by on their way home, shaking their heads. "Fools," one muttered. "When the storm comes, you'll see how much your stone mother listens." But Marta's gaze never wavered. The wind howled louder now, tearing at clothes and bending the trees in the square. Roof tiles rattled like loose bones. The church bell tolled once, though no hand had touched the rope. And yet the statue stood, unmoving, her stone face calm as the skies grew darker, as if she alone was unshaken by the fury about to descend. The first boards ripped from windows before midnight. Tin roofs peeled away like paper. The earth trembled as the hurricane drew closer, a monster's roar filling the night. Families clung to each other in their shuttered homes, praying the walls would hold. In the square, the Virgin Mary's statue remained a solitary figure against the storm. Rain lashed her face. Wind clawed at her robe of stone, but she did not bend. Those who had prayed earlier whispered from behind their doors, "She stands." She still stands. And those who had mocked found themselves glancing toward the square, unease gnawing at their certainty. The hurricane was not just wind and water. It was fear given form, ripping, tearing, breaking everything in its path. But amidst that fear, there was a single, haunting question that lingered in every heart, believer or doubter alike. When the winds come, what will still be standing? By morning, the hurricane had passed, but what it left behind would change the village forever. Because in a town of broken roofs and shattered walls, one figure still stood unmoved. The wind arrived like a freight train, screaming through the narrow streets, ripping shutters from windows and hurling them into the night. Tin roofs peeled back with a metallic wail, spiraling into the black sky like paper caught in a bonfire. Palm trees bent until their crowns scraped the ground, then splintered with gunshot cracks, branches flying like spears. The church, the heart of the village, groaned under the assault. Its steeple swayed dangerously, the great wooden doors buckling inward with every gust. Inside, pews rattled, candles snuffed out, and the stained glass windows shuddered as if one more breath of wind would shatter them into 1,000 pieces. The villagers who had taken refuge there clung to each other in the dark, their prayers competing with the roar of the storm. Elsewhere, families huddled in their homes. Some whispered Hail Marys, clutching rosaries so tight the beads cut into their palms. Others gritted their teeth and muttered, "We'll ride it out," though fear burned in their eyes. For some, faith was their anchor. For others, stubbornness was all they had left. In a small, weather-beaten house on the edge of the square, Marta sat with her 2 grandchildren pressed against her sides. The boy sobbed quietly, burying his face in her lap, while the girl clutched a cracked porcelain doll with trembling hands. The walls creaked. Water seeped under the door in thin streams. Every howl of the wind made the children flinch. Marta lifted her rosary and whispered, not to calm herself, but to calm them. "Stay with us, Mother. Do not leave us in this hour." Her voice was steady, though her eyes glistened. She knew the power of hurricanes. She had lived through 3 in her lifetime. She had seen homes flattened, livestock drowned, even lives taken. Yet she also knew the quiet comfort she had always felt when she whispered before the Virgin Mary's statue in the square. Tonight, she prayed that comfort would stretch across these fragile walls and hold her family together. Outside, the hurricane clawed at everything. It toppled fences, uprooted trees, hurled debris across the square. A cart was lifted from its wheels and dashed against the stone fountain with a deafening crash. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood exposed, the wind tearing at her robe of stone, rain hammering her bowed head. But still, she did not fall. She seemed small compared to the fury around her, and yet somehow she remained unshaken. Inside their shuttered homes, villagers felt despair, creeping in like floodwater. The sound was unbearable, a constant roar, like the earth itself had split open. Roofs cracked open above them, letting in sheets of rain. Walls trembled, beams groaned, whole houses shook as if they were about to collapse. In the church, someone cried out, "We will not survive this." But Marta, in her little house, closed her eyes, pressed the beads of her rosary to her lips, and whispered louder, "Stay with us, Mother. Please stay with us." And though the storm howled with a violence that seemed beyond anything human or divine, those words threaded through the darkness, fragile, defiant, unbroken. Because even as everything else was torn apart, there was one question the villagers would only ask when the morning came. If all can be destroyed in a single night, what or who could possibly remain? At dawn, the roar of the storm faded into an eerie silence. The wind fell suddenly still, leaving only the drip of water from broken rooftops and the groan of timbers sagging under the weight of the night's fury. One by one, doors creaked open. Villagers stepped out cautiously, their eyes wide, their movements slow, as though afraid the hurricane might return if they moved too quickly. What they saw stopped them where they stood. Houses lay in ruins, walls split open, roofs torn clean off, belongings scattered into the mud like children's toys. Streets were rivers, the cobblestones invisible under swirling brown water. The church, once proud and central, stood battered, its steeple leaning at a dangerous angle, half its roof ripped away. A gaping hole yawned where stained glass had once told stories of saints. People moved through the wreckage in stunned silence. Mothers pulled children from doorways, their faces streaked with mud and tears. Men lifted beams and broken planks, searching for tools, for food, for anything that had survived. The air smelled of salt and smoke, destruction heavy on every breath. And then came the murmurs. The first gasp was small, almost lost in the shuffle of feet on wet ground. Then another voice followed, trembling with disbelief. And then more, until the silence was broken by a single word whispered from every direction. How? In the center of the square, amidst the wreckage, she stood, the Virgin Mary statue, not cracked, not tilted, not moved an inch from where she had always been. Her stone robe was streaked with rain, but not broken. Her folded hands were as clean as if the storm had passed around her. Even the ground at her base, though littered with debris, seemed untouched, as if an unseen hand had shielded her from the chaos that tore the rest of the town apart. Villagers gathered slowly, their feet pulling them forward as if drawn by a force stronger than their fear. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, staring wide-eyed at the figure that had endured when everything else had fallen. Old men removed their caps, their weathered hands trembling as they pressed them against their chests. Marta arrived last, her grandchildren clutching her arms. She stopped short when she saw the statue. Her knees gave way, and she knelt in the mud, tears mingling with the rain still dripping from the rooftops. She stood, Marta whispered, her voice breaking. Through it all, she stood. Around her, voices overlapped. The church roof is gone, but she remains. The trees fell, but not her. The storm touched everything, everything but her. And for the first time, since the winds began, the people of San Isidro felt something stir within their grief. Not relief, not yet, but awe. A trembling sense that what they were witnessing was more than coincidence. The hurricane had stolen their homes, their food, their peace. But as they gathered in the flooded square, staring at the untouched figure of the Virgin Mary, a new thought whispered through their hearts. If she could remain unmoved, maybe they could too. The morning after the storm should have been filled with despair. The town of San Isidro looked like a battlefield. Roofs were gone, walls were broken, and the streets were rivers of mud and debris. Families stood in front of what had once been their homes, staring at splintered beams and shattered windows, their hearts heavy with the weight of loss. And yet, in the center of all that ruin, there she was, the Virgin Mary statue, standing, unmoved, untouched. Word spread quickly. Survivors who had taken shelter in the hills or inside half-collapsed buildings trickled into the square, drawn not by reason, but by something deeper. By mid-morning, dozens of people had gathered around her. Some stood silently, arms folded across their chests, their faces pale with exhaustion. Others wept openly, their tears mixing with the floodwater at their feet. Children clung to their parents, staring wide-eyed at the stone figure that seemed to defy everything they had just lived through. It was Marta, the widow, who made the first move. Her knees still ached from the hours spent praying through the night, but she stepped forward with slow, deliberate steps. In her hands, she carried the remains of a candle she had shielded during the storm. The wick was burned nearly to nothing, wax pooled unevenly, but it was all she had. She knelt at the statue's base and set it down carefully on a dry stone. "She stayed with us," Marta whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Now, we stay with her." The words hung in the air. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do, but then a young man, barely more than a boy, pulled a wild flower from the wreckage of his yard. Its petals were bent, its stem broken, but he laid it gently beside Marta's candle. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and she nodded. Then it began. One by one, survivors stepped forward. A mother tore a ribbon from her daughter's ruined dress and tied it around the base of the statue. A farmer laid down a handful of beans he had salvaged from his flooded field. A carpenter placed a splintered piece of wood, once part of his roof, at her feet, as if to say, "This too I offer." By noon, the base of the statue was covered with tokens: flowers, candles, scraps of cloth, bits of broken wood, even shards of shattered pottery, all laid down not as trash, but as offerings. To an outsider, it might have looked strange, but to the villagers, it was an act of defiance. The hurricane had taken nearly everything, but it had not taken her, and through her, it would not take their hope either. The square, once a place of panic, became a place of gathering. Neighbors who had not spoken in months embraced, tears running down their faces. Old quarrels seemed to dissolve in the shadow of the statue. One man, who had long refused to forgive his brother for a land dispute, pressed his forehead against him and whispered, "We are alive." "That's enough," the brother wept and clutched him close. Children who just hours earlier had hidden in fear now laughed faintly as they carried buckets of water to clean mud from the cobblestones around the statue. Their small hands wiped at the base, trying to make it shine again. And through it all, the Virgin Mary stood, her stone face unchanged, her folded hands as calm as ever. But to the people, she seemed more alive than she had ever been. That afternoon, Marta stood again before the crowd. Though her voice was thin, it carried with surprising strength. "We lost homes," she said. "We lost fields. We lost walls and roofs. But we did not lose her. She remained. And if she remained, then so can we." There was a murmur of agreement, soft at first, then louder. Heads nodded. Some crossed themselves. Others simply looked up at the statue with tears in their eyes. "We rebuild," Marta continued. "Not just houses, not just walls. We rebuild each other." The words struck something inside them. It was as if the weight of despair, which had threatened to drown them, suddenly lifted. Not gone, not erased, but lifted just enough to let them breathe again. And so they began. A mason, whose home had collapsed entirely, picked up his tools and said, "I will start with the church walls." She watched over us. Now we make her house whole again. A group of women gathered children and began preparing food from whatever supplies could be salvaged, distributing bowls to the hungry. A fisherman offered the use of his boat to ferry in aid from the next village once the waters calmed. People who had once lived quietly, even selfishly, began moving with a shared purpose. The statue had become their rallying point, not because she was stone, but because she had stood when everything else had fallen. She became a mirror of what they longed to be, unshaken, unmoved. That night, as darkness fell, the square glowed again. Dozens of candles flickered at the statue's base, their flames trembling but steady. Survivors gathered in a circle, not to mourn, but to sing. Old hymns rose into the night air, carried on voices cracked with exhaustion, but filled with something stronger than despair. Children fell asleep on their mothers' laps as the songs continued. Men clasped hands. Women swayed gently, their faces reflecting the candlelight. Marta sat closest to the statue, her rosary wrapped around her fingers, whispering thanks with every bead. For the first time since the hurricane's fury, peace settled over San Isidro. Not because the storm had spared them, it had not, but because mercy had remained in their midst, carved in stone, teaching them through silence that hope could stand even when walls could not. By the following morning, the square was no longer just the center of the town. It was the center of their recovery. People came with tools, with hammers, with nails. Others brought food to share. Strangers who had once looked past each other now worked shoulder to shoulder, sweat mixing with tears, as they began to rebuild. And always, always the statue stood in the middle, covered in flowers, lit by candles, surrounded by prayers. It was no longer just a monument. It was their heart. Because in the end, the hurricane had destroyed much, but it had also revealed something the villagers had forgotten, that faith, when shared, can rebuild what storms tear down. And as Marta whispered at the close of that long, hard day, she stood unmoved. And so will we. They came 3 days after the storm, when the village was still soaked in mud and grief, but already stirring with life again. Trucks rolled in on what was left of the road, reporters with cameras, government officials with clipboards, aid workers with crates of bottled water and rice. Their voices cut through the hum of hammers and the low murmur of rebuilding. The journalists went straight to the square, their cameras turned first on the ruined houses, the splintered trees, the half-collapsed church. But inevitably, their lenses found her. The Virgin Mary, unmoved, untouched. Even caked in rainwater stains, even surrounded by ruin, she looked as though she had never been touched by the storm. The images were broadcast within hours. Statue stands in hurricane's path. But what those headlines couldn't capture was the silence in the square, the awe in the voices of those who had seen it with their own eyes. An official, his boots covered in mud, shook his head as he inspected the scene. "Coincidence," he muttered, scribbling something into his notebook. The winds shift, debris misses. Nothing miraculous, just physics. A cameraman adjusted his lens, capturing the statue framed by shattered homes. He whispered to the reporter beside him, "Still, it's strange. Everything else is gone. Why her?" The villagers stood back, watching. They were used to disbelief. They expected it, but their own memories pressed against them too strongly to be ignored. Because they had noticed details the outsiders had not. A great tree, uprooted by the storm, lay sprawled across the square, its massive trunk split in two, yet somehow it had fallen in such a way that its branches bent around the statue, arching like a shield. Not a single limb touched her. The villagers swore they had seen it mid-fall, almost as if the wind itself had guided it aside. And there was the debris, or rather, the absence of it. Everywhere else, in San Isidro, the square was choked with rubble, tiles, wood, tin, branches, but not a single shard, not a single splinter lay at her feet. It was as if an invisible circle had been drawn around her, keeping the chaos away. Then there were the whispers. Several survivors from different houses told the same story. During the worst of the storm, when the winds shrieked and the roofs tore away, they had heard faint bells ringing. Not the church bell. It had fallen silent when the rope snapped. No, these were smaller, lighter, almost like chimes. Some said it came from the square. Others said it seemed to drift on the wind itself. But there were no bells in San Isidro. Not now. The officials dismissed it. Stress, they said. The mind hears what it wants when fear is high. The journalists were divided. Some nodded in agreement. Others lowered their cameras and looked at the villagers with something like unease. But for those who had been there was no simple dismissal. They remembered the way the candle at Marta's side had burned through the storm. They remembered the sudden quiet that seemed to hang around the statue while the world collapsed around it. They remembered the calm they had felt. Not relief, not safety, but a strange, unshakable calm, as if something greater had stood in their midst. Now, as the villagers laid more flowers at her feet, whispers carried through the square. Accident or mercy carved in stone? The question lingered heavier than the storm clouds that still floated over the hills. No official report, no news headline, no outsider explanation could erase what they had seen. Because in San Isidro, they didn't just see a statue. They saw a mother who had not abandoned her children. The days that followed the hurricane blurred into one another, a rhythm of sweat, ash, and aching muscles. San Isidro, once quiet and tucked away by the coast, was now a town stripped bare, but not broken. Amid the piles of wood and stone, amid the flooded fields and cracked roads, one constant rose above the chaos: the Virgin Mary's statue, standing at the heart of the square, unchanged. And slowly, the villagers realized they were not rebuilding around ruins. They were rebuilding around her. Each morning, before work began, men and women gathered in the square. They knelt, not long, just a moment, just enough to breathe. Then they rose and scattered to their tasks, lifting beams, repairing roofs, salvaging wood from what could be saved. The rhythm became so natural that no one questioned it. Work began only after they had stood before her. Children, too young to carry hammers, collected flowers from the fields outside the village. They placed them at her feet, small bouquets of wild lilies and daisies, fragile color against the gray of stone and mud. The statue became ringed with blooms, as though the earth itself had begun to heal in her shadow. The church, whose roof had been torn open, was one of the first priorities. Carpenters worked tirelessly, hammering new beams, laying fresh tiles. When the steeple was lifted upright again, cheers echoed through the streets. Yet even then, it was the statue in the square that people returned to, whispering thanks with blistered hands pressed together. News of the untouched statue spread beyond San Isidro. At first, it was only neighboring villages who heard the story: farmers, traders, fishermen, passing the tale along roads and rivers. But soon, strangers began arriving. A woman from 2 towns over came carrying a single candle, saying her sister had been lost in the storm. She placed the candle at the base of the statue and wept, whispering words no one else could hear. An old man limped into the square with a bundle of marigolds. He said nothing, only laid them gently at her feet and bowed before walking away. Pilgrims began to trickle in. Not in great floods, not as tourists, but quietly, reverently. Some left flowers, some left prayers, scribbled on scraps of paper, tucked into the cracks of the pedestal. Others left nothing at all, only their silence. The statue, once overlooked by all but the villagers, became a place where grief and hope met in equal measure. Marta noticed it first. One evening, as the villagers gathered to sing their nightly hymns, she counted faces she did not recognize among the crowd. They sang too, their voices trembling but sincere, joining in as though they had always belonged there. The square was no longer just San Isidro's heart. It was becoming something greater, a place where mercy had made itself visible. And yet, within the town itself, the transformation went even deeper. Old feuds dissolved. Two families who had not spoken for years because of a boundary dispute worked side by side, lifting stones to rebuild each other's homes. A group of fishermen pulled their remaining nets to ensure no family went hungry. The grocer, who once charged high prices during lean seasons, opened his storeroom freely, saying only, "She stood for us. I will not let anyone fall." It was not the statue's stone that changed them. It was what she had endured. She had weathered the winds without moving. And now, in her shadow, they discovered they could do the same. Children played in the square again, their laughter carrying where cries of fear had echoed just days earlier. Women hung laundry across broken beams, the white sheets flapping like banners of surrender that somehow looked like banners of victory. The scent of fresh bread returned as ovens were rebuilt, and with it, the rhythm of ordinary life, but now layered with something extraordinary. The doubters still came. Skeptics from outside still wrote articles, insisting it was chance, coincidence, engineering. "Stone is heavy," one wrote. Of course it would remain when wood and tile were blown away, but the villagers only smiled. For them, it was not about argument. It was about experience, because they remembered the storm, the fear, the night when everything shook, and how she did not. No explanation could take that away. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Marta stood before the statue with her grandchildren. The boy no longer clung to her skirts. He ran ahead, chasing after other children. The girl no longer trembled in fear. She carefully placed a daisy at the statue's feet and smiled as though she were giving it to a friend. Marta whispered, her hand on the stone base, "You stayed with us. And because of that, we stayed." Behind her, the villagers continued their work. Hammers struck, voices called instructions, fires crackled as meals were prepared for tired hands. Life was not easy, not yet, but it was alive again. Weeks passed, and San Isidro began to look like itself once more. Roofs gleamed with fresh tiles, doors hung on new hinges, and the church bell, repaired and rehung, rang out for the first Sunday after the storm. When it tolled, villagers wept openly, their voices rising in hymns that carried far beyond the hills. Yet still, every evening, they gathered in the square, not because the church was gone, not because they needed a replacement, but because the statue had become the reminder they could not forget that even when the winds tried to take everything, mercy still stood. The square was no longer a place of ruin. It was a place of rebirth. Flowers bloomed where mud once lay. Pilgrims came not only to mourn, but to celebrate. And at the center, the Virgin Mary's statue remained unmoved. And so San Isidro was transformed. Not by the storm, not by the rebuilding, but by the simple truth that hope had endured in stone when all else had fallen. The winds tried to take everything, but when the storm passed, mercy still stood. If this story touched you, share it, because the world needs to be reminded that even in destruction, faith can remain unbroken.